World War II. So, so I told you that the feminine can be, the terrible unknown things can be represented by the feminine, sort of a monstrous figure, but it's certainly the case that the monstrosity of culture is roughly equivalent to the monstrosity of nature. And one of the things you might think about is that common ideologies tend to utilize these symbolic categories. It's almost as if they appropriate them. So the environmental movement, for example, basically says benevolent nature, right? So that's the positive feminine. Negative culture, because that's cultures out there rapaciously destroying the pristine wilderness of Mother Nature, and the negative individual too, because human beings are part of that as individuals, and we're kind of a cancer on the face of the planet. If I mean, that's a pretty dark way of looking at it, obviously, but it's one-sided, because you can easily say, yeah, well, we're in a war with nature because obviously she's trying to kill us as fast as possible, and we better have some culture because otherwise we'd be sitting outside in the freezing snow, and you might be a rapacious consumer, but on the other hand you're just trying to survive, and it's not that easy. And so you need to have both of those stories together before you have a reasonable representation of the world. It's not easy to cope with something like that. It's not easy to cope with something like that, and every institution has this potential and this element, because institutions tend towards bureaucratization and tyranny as they develop. They close up and become rigid, and so that's a rough thing to deal with. And then of course this is a rough thing to deal with too. So you might think, well, you could have a little bit of sympathy for human beings, not just throw them in the horrible rapacious creature category, which I think is an extraordinarily pathological and also a pre-genocidal thing to do. Because you hear environmentalists, for example, now and then say, the planet would be better off without people on it. It's like, well, that's kind of what Hitler thought as well, about certain kinds of people anyways, and God only knows where he would have stopped. So, when someone says something like that, one of the things you might think is, you should take a good look at your unconscious structure there, bucko, because fundamentally, there's a genocidal ideology at the bottom of your thought structure, and you might think that you're an environmentalist, but you're actually possessed by a genocidal ideology, and you better do something about that, because if you ever get any power, you're going to be one dangerous creature. So one of the things that's really interesting about psychoanalysis, and one of the things I love about it, is that the psychoanalysts tell you, if someone says, I'm good, or I stand for a good thing, the first thing you want to look for is the opposite of that. It's like, okay, that's what you say. What might really be going on? Or is it actually the case that you're Jesus Christ and all the saints combined? You're this perfect person. Or are there dark motives for what you're doing that you claim to be doing for the good? So a guy named George Orwell, who was one of the world's most creative essayists in the 20th century, he was a left-winger. He wrote some things that were very critical of socialist movements, and was one of the early critics of Soviet Russia, when it was sort of in vogue among intellectuals to be supportive of the Soviets. One of the things he said about left-wing socialists was that they didn't really like the poor. He was talking about middle-class left-wing socialists, not the working-class guys who were in the unions and, had some justification for their struggle against those who were at the top of the power hierarchy. He was more looking at people that were already at the top of the power hierarchy, who were claiming to be advocates for the working class. And his claim fundamentally was that those people didn't like the poor, they just hated the rich. And it was difficult for the publisher who was publishing that book, which was called Road to Wigan Pier, which is an amazing book. It's a book about coal miners in northern Britain, and it's brutal. Those people had brutal lives, man. So, but anyways, the publisher, which was the Left Book Club, if I remember correctly, was very loath to publish the essay that went along with that book, because it was such a devastating criticism of sort of middle-class socialism. Anyways. So the psychoanalysts are always telling you, look, there you are, there's no monster. It's like, okay, where's the monster? Because it's somewhere. It's somewhere, because there's a monster in everyone, and if you're hiding it or covering it up or pretending that, you only stand for the good, it's like, all that means is that you're ignorant and naive about your own possibility. There's a monster around there somewhere. So, yeah, and that's partly because, if you're not a monster, it's pretty hard to stay alive. Because, you have to contend with things like this. sorry, things like this, and things like this, and things like this, and things like this, you know, that's your life. You contend with that. Nature is brutal, culture is brutal, and other people can be brutal too, and so if you're not prepared for that and able to withstand it, then you're just going to get rolled over. So you better get the old inner monster developed, because, and under conscious control, because even though it's a terrible thing, you need it. So the Taoists, for example, they represent the world in terms that are quite similar to those that I just described for you. So the central Taoist symbol is this one, the yin-yang symbol, and yang basically stands for order. That's what it means, but it means all the things that I've listed there. It means order, masculinity, the daytime, the known. It also means authoritarianism and fascism. And then yin, on the opposite side, is chaos, femininity, the night, the unknown, decadence, and nihilism. And it's also a relationship between the conscious and the unconscious. The consciousness is represented by light, and the reason for that is, well, when are you conscious? You're conscious during the day, right? Because we're creatures that live in the day, unlike rats, for example. You know, they live at night. So for us, consciousness is associated with enlightenment and illumination and daytime and sunrise and the bright noon sky, and the unconscious is associated with the nighttime. And the reason for that partly too is that your unconscious is actually a lot more active at night. First of all, that's when you dream, and it's also the time when, if you're frightened of something or if you're depressed and ruminative, the frightening thoughts and the depressing and ruminative thoughts are going to come up. So many people have the experience of waking up in a kind of quasi-cold sweat at 3 in the morning and having, you know, nothing but a continual stream of worries run through their head. And there's pretty good evidence that a lot of what you're doing at night when you sleep, when you're dreaming and when you're not dreaming, is actually processing threat. You know, but most of the time you're asleep for that. Sometimes you wake up during it and it's like, it's not something you really want to be conscious about, you know. It's hard on you, and it's very common among people who are depressed, you know. So if you want to diagnose someone for depression, one of the things you ask them is, well, is your sleep chopped up? You know, do you wake up multiple times at night? And when you wake up, what happens? And if they say, well, you know, I have worries running through my head and I can't stop them, that's rumination, because it's an automatic process, it's an unconscious process. Then you know that the balance between positive and negative emotion has shifted too far for that person. There's so much chaos and pain in their life, or their emotional systems have become dysregulated, that it's starting to pop up into consciousness and dominate it. So, now, the yin-yang symbol is interesting for a variety of other reasons too, because the Taoists believe that that symbol represents being. Now, being is not the same thing as objective reality. Being is what you experience as a conscious creature. That's being. And for the Taoists, being is made up of these two elements, order and chaos. And the reason for that is quite straightforward. The reason for that is wherever you go, and whenever you live, and whoever you are, each environment that you're in is composed of things you understand, and things that work the way you expect them to, and things you do not understand, and that can pull the rug out from you at any moment. And so you can say in some sense that these symbolic representations are representations of the most unchanging elements of being. So the most real things, because, you know, a typical modern person will look at this and think, well, those aren't real. It's like, they are real. In fact, they're hyper real, because one of the things that defines real is that it's permanent. And it is permanent. No matter where you go, there are things you know and things you don't know. And it doesn't matter who you are. It's permanent. So it's part of the existential landscape of human being.